Hi, guys. Today we're going to kind of wrap up the whole chapter and talk about how to choose which method is the best method for solving based on what the problem looks like. This will have a nice review of everything that we've learned so far. And then during our live session, either today or tomorrow, we will do an activity where you guys practice using all of this information. And it's a really great activity because it's going to review everything that we've learned so far. This will be our last video. And today will also be our last paper homework. Yay, it's the practice quiz. And then so at this point in time, like today, we're done, right? So I will have assigned all of your paper homework. At this point in time, you should be capable of completing all of Delta Math. And that means that there will be nothing new posted tomorrow on Friday. There will be one new posting next Monday, which is the Delta Math quiz, right? So we always take that practice quiz to get ready for our test. So that's the one thing that you can look for next week is the Delta Math quiz. Otherwise, after this, we're done with this chapter. Okay, so let's take a look. So today we're going to be using the discriminant to tell not only what our final answer would look like, but also what would be the best method to use to solve the problem. The discriminant, remember, is the part that was underneath the square root sign for the quadratic formula. It's b squared minus 4ac. And there were 4 different scenarios of the discriminant. So here are the 4 scenarios. You could get a positive number that was a perfect square, so you know the square root of it. Or you could get literally any other positive number in the world, so a positive number that you don't know the square root of. You could get the number 0, or you could get a negative answer. So these are the 4 different possibilities of what your discriminant answer could look like. Based on those 4 different answers, we can choose one of the 3 different ways that we learned to solve. So the 3 ways we learned to solve was solving by factoring, solving by the quadratic formula, and then our most recent one, solving by completing the square. For our first scenario with the discriminant, if you get a number that you know the square root of, it's a perfect square. That means that you will get the phrase was 2 real unequal rational roots. But basically what that means is your answers are going to be nice. They're going to be pretty. They're going to be a whole number. They're going to be a decent fraction, not a crazy fraction, but a decent fraction. Since the answers are definitely going to be nice answers, that means that that problem was factorable. So if your discriminant is a perfect square, and I don't tell you which method to use to solve it, you can totally solve by factoring. When we're solving by factoring, you can only get nice answers. So if your answer is going to have a square root in it, or if your answer is going to be imaginary, factoring is not an option for solving. So perfect square is great for factoring. The other scenario that would be great for factoring is if your discriminant is 0. When your discriminant is 0, that means that you got a double root. You got the same number twice. And that number will be a nice number or a decent fraction. It'll be a whole number. It'll be like 5/2. It's not that bad of a fraction, right? And so if your discriminant is 0, that is also a perfect candidate for factoring. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that if your discriminant is 0, that means that when you're factoring, it's going to be a perfect square trinomial. So you'll get a parentheses squared. That's how you get that double root, is you get the same parentheses twice when you're doing your factoring. Okay? So those are the 2 scenarios where you would want to do factoring. Now, if you get a determinant that is any other positive number in the whole entire world, so a positive number that you don't know the square root of, then you're going to have a radical in your answer. And it might be like a rad 5, or it might be like a 2 rad 6 or something, right? But it's going to have a radical in the answer. And since there's going to be a radical in the answer, that means that that problem is not factorable. So you'll need to choose one of the other 2 methods, either quadratic formula or completing the square. Now, quadratic formula is great to use when the problem is not factorable. And if there's a number in front of your x squared that would be also a great time to use quadratic formula. And if your middle term, the one in front of the x, is an odd number, that's also a great time to use quadratic formula. Those last two things, a number in front of the x squared and a middle term that is odd, those are things that would make completing the square a very difficult problem to do. So if you're going to choose completing the square, then you want to make sure that there's no number in front of your x squared and that your middle term is even. Those are the best candidates for completing the square. And in our live class activity, we will talk about, again, like when to use which one. Finally, if your discriminant is negative, that means that you're going to have an imaginary answer. There's going to be an I in your answer. And I technically is a radical. It's the square root of -1. So if your discriminant is negative, it's the same as getting a rad in the answer. So also you would want to choose between quadratic formula or completing the square. So if I don't give you a mandatory way of solving, if I don't say you have to solve by factoring or you have to solve by completing the square, right? Then you can pick. And the way to pick is by finding the discriminant and then choosing which method is best. Now I'm going to do one example of the process for this, like the thought process for this, so that you guys know what I'm looking for when we do our live lesson. So here's my example, x squared minus 7x plus 8 equals 0. And so what I would like you guys to do first for this activity that we're going to be doing today is I would like you to start by finding your discriminant. Okay, b squared minus 4ac. Now, some of you are typing that out as the discriminant. That is not the discriminant. You actually do need to do the work. You need to find the single number. So make sure you're either typing it in your calculator or, I mean, this one's not too difficult to do in your head. It's 49 minus 32. 49 minus 32 is 17. So like you do have to actually do the work. Don't just type out the problem. Like get that single number. So my discriminant in this problem is 17. Now, 17 is not a perfect square. It's prime, right? So since it's not a perfect square, I cannot do solving by factoring. Since it's not a perfect square, I know for a fact that there's going to be a radical in the answer. It's actually going to be a rad 17 because remember that 17 is the number from under the square root sign in the quadratic formula. Now that we've eliminated factoring as a possible way of solving, we want to choose between quadratic formula and completing the square. To choose between those two, you want to look at two things. You want to look at if there's a number in front of the x squared, and there is not. So right now, both of these are still a good candidate. If there was a number in front of the x squared, then you would say, I'm not going to do completing the square. And then the second thing you want to look at is your middle term. And if your middle term is odd, then you don't want to do completing the square. You only want to do completing the square if the middle one is even. So since the middle term is odd, I am going to say that I don't want to do completing the square. So I'm definitely going to solve this by quadratic formula. So that's kind of the thought process that you want to go through when you're choosing which method to use. The other thing I'm going to ask you in today's activity is I'm going to ask you for which of these answers could potentially be the answer. And so based on the discriminant, we should be able to figure out which answer is the most logical answer. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that this is the actual answer. I'm not saying that I solved this, but based on the discriminant, we should pick the answer that's the most likely answer. So I'm going to choose this one. I'm choosing that one because my discriminant is not a perfect square. So I will not get nice answers. So I'm not going to choose the 4, 2. My discriminant is not 0, so I'm not going to get a double root. And my discriminant is not negative, so I'm not going to get an imaginary answer. I'm going to get an answer with a rad in it. And this is the only answer that just has a rad and not an I. All right, so this is to help us with our activity during class today. And your actual homework assignment is the practice quiz. So that'll cover everything that we've learned, and we'll go over that next week.